Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second of our new format of dialogues. My name is Tom Dennis, and I'm the CEO of Serenity and Leadership, which is a culture change consultancy and training organization with a focus on diversity and inclusion. In our work, we're clear that without real inclusion, an organization's culture won't be as good as it could be. So the aim in these events each month is to initiate a dialogue by inviting an expert in their field to cover an aspect. And today the subject is design for inclusion, and our speaker is Suzie Lewis, but I'll introduce her just a little later. First, we'd like you to check in. And we're going to break you up into groups and invite everyone to speak your name, who you work for, and how you're feeling today. There is a facilitator in each group, but please keep your piece brief. We don't have a great deal of time for this. But what we found is it is very important for everyone to have their voice heard. So over to you, Joanne.
Right, I'm just literally created the breakout rooms, so I'm going to open the rooms now, and I'll see you who's joining me in room 4, but everyone will disappear off and see you back in the main room shortly. Right, hyperspace time.
I'd like to introduce Suzie Lewis. Before creating her own company, Transform for Value, Suzie spent 20 years in the aeronautical industry, leading a wide assortment of flagship projects and teams, large and small. Today, she's focused on transforming organizational cultures to bring out the best in people, to bring out the best in their business. As we say here at Serenity and Leadership, organizations thrive when people thrive. Suzie believes passionately in inclusion as a journey, not a project or an event. Suzie, we are kindred spirits, and it's a real pleasure to have you here today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. For those of you that know me, I have 15 minutes to speak, so that's quite a challenge in itself. So I'm going to try and keep it brief. I'm thrilled to be here today. As Tom says, I'm passionate about inclusion. I'm passionate about what it brings to people and what it can bring in terms of competitive advantage in organizations, but also in terms of well-being in society. So, you know, if I say to you, what is inclusion? I'm sure that I would have as many words as there are people in this virtual room today. But I want to take the hypothesis that inclusion is the fundamental right to equal rights and respect. And that is something that has always fueled everything I've done in work and in home life. But it's also about empathy, curiosity, and listening. And I tried to find some pictures for me that define what inclusion is. And these three sum it up really well. It is about listening and working together. It is about different perspectives, but it's also about authenticity. It's about bringing your digital print or your physical thumbprint, bringing who you are to the table. So that's what inclusion is for me. And we don't all have to agree on that, but this is how I frame inclusion. But I just want to spend a couple of seconds on what it's not, okay? So it's not easy. It's not a nice to have. As Tom says, it's not a project. It's not an event. And it's not a HR subject. Or it's not only a HR subject. I get a lot of people saying to me, but why do inclusion? HR deal with that. And I think a lot of the subjects do fall into the HR basket, so to speak. And there are lots of diversity, measures on diversity and the diversity of populations and the number of women and the different nationalities and the different minority groups. And we have measures like that, and they're often held in a HR dashboard. But research shows that only 20% of existing diversity officers actually look at that data. So we're measuring something, but it's not moving the needle on inclusion. And it's not really being measured for any reason other than to say it's on a dashboard. So I like to think of inclusion as difference. So using difference as a positive lever, but also what makes us the same. So all human beings need belonging, they need respect, they need recognition, and they need to live and work in an environment where they feel valued. So that for me is an inclusive culture. It's about moving to a culture of courage and not a culture of fear. And today in organizations, that isn't necessarily the way the culture works, or the unwritten codes of the culture, or the power structures, or the way the hierarchy works within the organization. And I feel very strongly about that. And people say to me, so what do you mean then, designing for inclusion? So designing for inclusion, what does that mean? I wanted to take 3 different areas of examples that I thought everyone would probably identify with. The first one, meetings. Okay, a culture that is not designed for inclusion. Meetings, you may get shouted over, you may not be able to challenge people, you may not even bother expressing yourself because you don't think anybody's going to listen, and then you just disengage and either talk to your neighbor, look at your phone, or just look out the window. Talent. You know, how familiar does this sound when leaders get territorial? Oh yeah, he's great or she's great, but they're mine. So I am my results and I want them to do a communal project, but they stay in my team and I have to have control over them. And promotion. Okay, it took me ages to find this icon for promotion because it was what I wanted to say. It wasn't about any particular person. There wasn't a ladder on it. It was about people rocketing their potential. But today, in terms of promotion, often in organizations, there is less and less diversity as we get up the ladder, so to speak. And the senior positions, sometimes you don't even know they're open and they're filled. So there's a lack of transparency and there's a lack of communication. That is systems that are not designed for inclusion. If I just flip that on its head, systems that are designed for inclusion, meetings, it can be as simple as the leader asking for multiple perspectives, or saying he or she doesn't know, or doing a check-in, making sure that that space is created for everyone's voice to be heard. Or talent. My dream is to crowdsource the definition of talent. What does that mean? Let's take people out of the boxes they're in, and it's not necessarily a linear progression. And here we come to the employee experience. And I love the idea that the employee experience is not what HR says it is, or what business says it is, or what the consultants say it is. It's what the employees say it is. It's whether they feel included and how they experience those processes. So if I go back to promotion, there's a lot of data available now with people analytics where we can see what's happening in these processes and we can provide transparency across the processes. And then we can do something with that data. So I looked at all these things, and from my time in organizations and observing and trying to understand, I thought, okay, how can I simplify and demystify this subject, which seems to be just seen as, oh, it's something to do with diversity. Yeah, it's something to do with, we need to put KPIs on a dashboard. And I thought, and how can I make it tangible? And I came back to the idea of what is common to all of us. And I think there are 3 trends, and it's the shift from I to we. So as the world becomes more interconnected, we all need to move from individual to collective. So that's the ego to eco. And you can see this playing out in organizations as they need to look at things like top level processes, like performance management, where you need to stop rewarding individual behavior if you want a collective result. And that means you have to think about systems. So the interconnectedness of different elements, different people, different interactions, human systems part. And then I don't know if you're Star Wars fans, but I am. And Master Yoda there, who always says, you must unlearn what you have learned, for me is the most important thing around what's going on in today's world, and is completely linked to what we need to do for inclusion. Because you need to constantly unlearn what you've learned and relearn how to do things. If I look at something like banking, can you remember the last time you walked into a bank? I can't, because I don't have to. Even before COVID, I didn't have to. I now have an app for that. So it's learning new habits. But if I take the idea of an application and an iPhone, inclusion is changing your operating system. And learning, unlearning, and relearning is around constantly reappraising. Let's take unconscious bias. You have to step out of your own system and look at your unconscious bias to make it conscious. And then what? And that is the key to understanding inclusion is to always be able to take that step to unlearn what you've learned and look at how you could relearn it. It's essentially curiosity. So I came to my 4 building blocks. I looked and I thought, what's common to everything? What are the foundational blocks to building such an environment, and therefore then to designing on that foundational block? And I chose this on purpose, this picture of the Jenga game. I love this game. We play it a lot in my family. But for me, it's really, really about what inclusion's about. It's wobbly. It's made up of lots of different parts. If you pull one of the things in slightly the wrong direction, it can fall over. And if you walk past it without noticing and just walk straight past it, it can fall over. And for me, this is really about the equilibrium of inclusion in organizations. You need empathy. You need to be able to understand what's going on for the other person, how they are experiencing the environment, the invisible parts of the environment, the power systems, the informal dynamics, but also how they're feeling in the team and in the way they're being treated. Psychological safety, we hear a lot about this, is key for me. It's trust, but it's more than trust. And it's not about being nice. It's about giving candid feedback and being able to healthily challenge. So when you feel safe enough in your interpersonal relationships to come as you are and challenge what's going on in the system. So when you have empathy and psychological safety, it brings you to co-responsibility, which is around, we're back to the promotion discussion around accountability of who's responsible for what and what's happening in the system, and taking co-responsibility. So we're taking a step away from the more fear-based blame culture. Okay. And then collective vision. And I think COVID has shown that when the pressure is on and it gets tough, you need a purpose that's bigger than you. And we need a purpose that's bigger than us. But that collective vision, there's no point in doing it with 2 people and putting it on the wall. You need to come back to the empathy. You need to go and find people who are as different as possible from you and get their perspective and get them to create that collective vision with you. And these 4 areas together form a foundational block that allow you to understand what other people are going through, to empathize with that, and to actually have that co-creative process of, okay, so how can we do things differently? And it can be as small as a meeting, or it can be as big as, let's look at the governance of an organization. This brings me to design thinking. So when I say design for inclusion, it is a little bit of a play on words, because there's the figuratively, I'm going to deliberately design for inclusion, and then the design thinking process, which I'm a massive fan of, partly because it's simple and partly because it makes things tangible. And for me, it creates a frame that brings with it different cognitive and emotional processes for people to think differently about subjects. So you can see in the first 2 areas of empathize and define, let's really understand the needs of the user or the customer or the employee. Let's empathize with these people and see what their needs are, what they feel, and what they're looking for. Ideation. Okay, let's go into a different space and let's create that space of psychological safety where we suspend judgment, there are no right or wrong answers, and we all just, I like to say, pour our heads onto the table and let's see what happens. And that is pure innovation from diverse perspectives. But often, unless you create that space in organizational culture, that isn't the way it works. And then you move on to prototype and testing, which for me is the iterative loop that allows you to define your model. Because as we said right at the beginning, inclusion is very personal and organizational culture is not the same anywhere. So the whole collective vision piece is, let's understand our population together. Let's look at what could be, and then let's look at what works for us. And this is where it comes to designing, prototyping is often used for products, for wireframes, for mock-ups. And I feel very strongly about the fact you can actually make things tangible and prototype approaches. So you can prototype the minimum viable environment, for example. What would it look like? Who would be involved? And what would have to change? And I'm a big believer in you can't manage what you can't measure. And I think we need to start measuring inclusion. And it can be as simple as asking people how they're experiencing the environment. So it's really about centering it around the human being and getting people involved and creating a space where cognitively it's different, and you encourage people to step out of their mental models and to think differently. So we're back to the learn, unlearn, relearn, and the reappraising of what we say to ourselves and of how we show up at work. And I'm conscious of time, so I want to leave you with my last thoughts around this. Understand what inclusion is and what it isn't for you and your community, whether that's a team or an organization. Get curious and speak to people and engage in those courageous conversations. They may not be comfortable, but psychological safety isn't comfortable, but it's incredibly powerful. Listen to what is being said and also to what isn't being said. I'm a big believer in learning by doing. Create developmental practice, new habits, new processes based on employee input or customer input or the input of the people around you. Constantly co-create on the what and the how. We are more intelligent together. Now, in a fast-paced environment where we need to deliver, you think, oh, it's quicker, I'll do it myself, me included. But I've learned, and I now learn to take the step back, because you do go further together. And then role model the right behaviors and use your voice. Everybody has a voice in the system. Use your voice to call out those that don't. We all have a responsibility in an inclusive environment to be an agent of change and to be a choice for how we show up and how we use our voice. And this reminds me of the Maya Angelou quote, which, just to finish, sums it up for me: of people will maybe forget how you make them, what you said and what you did. They will never forget how you made them feel. And that, for me, is when you know that you've created an inclusive environment, when people feel included. Thank you. That's 15 minutes. No, Tom, I was quite...
It's amazing.
I'm quite proud of myself.
Thank you so much. I really acknowledge your self-control to get this down to the tightness. But hopefully that leaves more space for the dialogue, and that's great. So the next thing now is to invite everybody to go into pairs. And there's just a simple question, really, which is, what did you hear and what touched you? So I'm going to invite you to go into pairs now. And just for a couple of minutes, what I suggest is that you just introduce yourselves to each other, appoint an A and a B, and A goes for about 90 seconds, and then B goes for 90 seconds, and then I'll call you back in. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this process that we've been working with for the last year, dialogue is not a conversation. So what I'd invite you to do is to think of us as sitting in a circle, because in a circle, there's no hierarchy. And think about listening. This is fundamentally about listening. So, and it's based on the 3 levels of listening: listening to the other person to hear what they're saying, but then listening to oneself and noticing what is the reaction that we have that's going on inside, and to own that before we try and speak ourselves. So you may want to say, well, what I've just heard has made me feel, or as a result of that, I react in a particular way. And it's completely welcome, whatever that reaction is. You may feel inspired, you may feel angry, you may feel frustrated, whatever it is. And that's bringing the authenticity of dialogue into the group. And that's the 3rd level of listening, which is to the group itself and what's going on at the group level, and how are we creating a deeper level of meaning and understanding as a result of what is being said. Please come to this without judgment. That's always very, very difficult. But if you can remember that the opposite of judgment is curiosity, that might help the way that you listen. The aim is to harness the collective intelligence of the group and create a fellowship of trust. And we do welcome conflict within the values of respect and the spirit of fellowship. But it's an opportunity to move through conflict and disturbance to the other side. And that's where we learn and grow. So the floor is open. Over to you.
This is Gary, Gary Twine, Birmingham, UK. Yeah, I guess some of the things that were brought up. This all seems quite similar to nonviolent communication. William B. Rosenberg, going forward without judgment and using empathy to understand the needs of the person opposite you, and it's a two-way street. It's a two-way communication. It's not that is shared both ways. It's not just something that is the person opposite you, but they also understand about your needs, and you don't have to agree with somebody else's beliefs, but you can understand their needs basically. And so obviously by understanding these needs, it allows you to be flexible and adapt and make change, which makes people more included basically. And I found for many years of I was quite a passive child, many years of bullying, punched in the face every day, up to the age of like 18 or something. I was, always found myself somebody that I couldn't bring myself to punch somebody back. It just wasn't in me, basically. And of course, society kind of shaped me then. My experiences made me into somebody that realized after experience that sometimes when you push back, the bullies back off. But after going through therapy, after years of anxiety and depression, and the therapist mentioned nonviolent communication, I realized that those beliefs sunk. They were very close to my default, my programming as a child. These brought me back to somebody who I believe I was like 20 years prior, for example, and it's allowing me to grow again and not be stagnant and stuck in the way of current society. So yeah, that's what I've gotten from this, and it's nice to see that it's got these similar lines of thinking.
May I respond to that, Tom? It's Gillian Williams. Firstly, Gary, really touched me to hear you talking about your experience. And I work a lot with people who have been in your situation, whether it was earlier in life or at work, being in a bullied situation. And it struck me that what Suzie was talking about in terms of psychological safety, here's where it gets really, really difficult, because we're relying on managers to create an environment that everybody feels safe in. And some people who will feel less comfortable being safe because of past experiences. And one of the things that I think needs a lot of focus on from managers is understanding things like the climate of banter and sarcasm and how it can impact on people. And so therefore it might not be very explicit that the climate's not great because people are shouting or doing things. I don't think people do that in the workplace anymore, but it can be about cliques, it can be about little comments and things like that, which just make people feel uncomfortable about speaking up because of their psychological safety. So thank you for sharing your story, Gary.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And to be honest, everything you said makes complete sense. That I completely agree, especially if you're in a studio. Like I'm a designer, and in many years you have design agencies. A lot of studios are full of guys, and you'd have maybe one female in the studio, and guys together, all they do is rip each other. They make jokes about each other. And you do have these little cliques, so these groups of people, basically, and also distance. So if you're based in London and in a group based in Birmingham and in Manchester, that distance and that divide also brings change. And unfortunately, people, these managers and these directors, they're all only human as well. And you get experiences where you're in a meeting where the whole team across the country involved, but the lead is talking to just the people in that room in London, for example, and only at the end does he go, oh, of course, I mean all you people out there as well. But it's obvious that they're talking to the people in the room, and and if you're not kind of in that in group, you do suffer for it, unfortunately. And yeah, they can be quite toxic environments. They can become, and it's only after leaving KPMG, after being there for 13 years, And I kept driving myself to reinvent myself every 3 years. And I did it out of fear, really, fear of rejection and anxiety, depression. I didn't know, I wasn't diagnosed at the time. And I'd end up with random ailments and sent to specialists. And each time they'd go, you need to leave the job or it's going to kill you, basically. And it's only when I was made redundant that all of that has gone, that pressure, that stress, that anxiety. I feel literally so much better. And because it's almost like the toxin has been flushed out, basically. And, you know, because there's that whole, it builds up, especially over the years, people, and also the ethos of a team is based, it comes from the top. You know, the person at the top, basically they create the way of thinking, the way of doing, basically. And so the team leads, it comes down like a pyramid downwards to the people below them. And so people feel pressured to stay in that triangle of this, the purpose of the individual person, the purpose of the person at the top. But that's not individuality. That is raising a flag, that's following a flag, basically. It's not allowing for individual to shine through, basically. So yeah, I everything you said, I completely recognize and agree with it, to be honest, from experience over the years.
I heard what Gary just said, and my apologies before I continue speaking, because I have my son here and he's 19 months, so it might be that you hear him in the background. But what Gary just said, because I'm unemployed right now and I'm searching for a job. And when I look at the job description and I see that there is looking for someone who's stress resilient, and the first questions that come up in my mind is, how are they in the company? Because that's the sign for inclusion. Are they respectful towards each other? Is that what's causing the stress for people, that people have to be stress resilient? Or everybody working, cooperating properly together? So it's all about the managing, trickling down how the behavior has to be within the company. So I heard what you just said, Gary, and it really makes sense. That's why now I have these alarm bells when I see looking for someone stress resilient. That's one of the questions I always ask. Why does it mention that you need someone that has to be stress resilient?
That seems like a red flag to me. That seems go away. Don't go over it, because it just seems like that maybe, I mean, this is a judgment, the way I'm saying it. This is, I don't know this by fact, obviously, but it just seems like somebody that says that means that you're going to be given crazy deadlines and, you know, minimal respect, not treated as an equal.
Yeah.
And especially if there's some kind of service elements to your job. Like as a designer, I work in the service industry, and you can be working with people who are your equals as a grading in the company, you're the same level, but who treat you like lesser because you're a supplier in the company. And there's that class system, unfortunately. So yeah, yeah, good call. I would say that definitely rang, you know, that rings alarm bells to me, to be honest. Definitely from my experience, definitely having enjoying your time somewhere. If it's like 10 years of your life, for example, 5 years of your life, if you're living that, if you're in worry, if you're worried and stressed and anxious all the time, that's not a good way to live your life. And there are always better jobs and better ways. And you know, of course, people can say they're inclusive and they can get awards, but companies, but that doesn't mean they really, even though that might be the values, the core values of the company, doesn't mean that the people in the department they work for actually believe in that or practice it, unfortunately. But that, of course, that doesn't stop people like ourselves from trying to spread that message and try to bring people together, even in those sort of areas. And I guess it needs people like ourselves to go into places like this to actually try to make change, really. Otherwise they'll never change. And if it's just a corporate mandate, then there's a certain amount of cynicism to some degree, I believe. It has to be wanted. People have to want to do it, and they have to understand why they want to do it. And if it's just like we're now changing our values to be more inclusive, because that's a PR thing, a corporate thing, corporate responsibility. There's no empathy there. It's a strategy.
Gary, what you just said about that is absolutely like top notch. Thanks for saying that, because seriously, I've struggled 15 years. I basically was born with my health condition. So I lived a very sheltered life. I graduated from the best university, Cass Business School in the city. When they see that name, they're like, you're perfect. But then as soon as I disclosed my disability, excuses went flying across the room. And this was 15 years ago when the financial crisis happened. I was the last to be considered because there were so many people that needed jobs and so few jobs. I was the last to be considered. And at that time, that was the problem. And the same time, I had to struggle with the belief back then that under the government during that time, students had to work for free to prove they were suitable. And being disabled, I had to prove even more. So the average student would work 2 years to prove they were suitable. And I had to try and do that too. And then having a disability, I fell into all temping, contracting, and my CV became automatically choppy because I needed to prove myself. 15 years later, no change. And I have to say, now that we're in lockdown, I believed that the flexibility that has developed and working from home and all that would make a change. But I've been in the PwC events twice about flexibility and inclusion recently. And I had one yesterday and I decided not to go in because I was so disappointed, because I would ask questions, and flexibility, inclusion, diversity is more about, other things, other aspects, like our healthy counterparts, like maybe it's race or maybe it's LGBTQ, and that's important. It has to be included. But we're still excluded. We're still excluded, whether it's an unseen disability like a health condition, or whether it's an invisible disability like mental health, or whether it's a physical disability. We're still frigging struggling. And I don't get why it has to be that way. And I wrote an article on the Everyday magazine. A lot of people have said that is very amazing. I would suggest going on Google and searching Cass Business School, studying the 2-tick scheme. If anyone remembers this, please talk about it. 2-tick scheme, shambles, 10 years of the 2-tick scheme. Yeah. My professor did the study and it was proved that it was absolute rubbish. Out of 8,000 companies that had the 2-tick scheme, 15% covered some of the criteria, not all 5 criteria. And I used to talk about it and people used to say, no, Maria, that's not true. The law is against it. Really? Try and tell a company that. So I'm sorry to be negative and the devil's advocate and to be like one of those people that is complaining, and people tell me, don't complain, Maria, do your meditation, Maria. No. Meditation helps you to the point of calming down. It doesn't change the theory of the social theory of disability. Look it up. It's out there. Scope created it decades ago. The social theory of disability says that it's society that is making disability a problem, because you don't have a problem. And if you can't change society, you can see I'm very angry. Anger is always going to be in your life because you can't change society, and no amount of meditation or going to a psychologist is going to change that unless society becomes empathetic, and empathy is close to impossible to create in someone. It's not going to change my life. I'm always going to be angry. I'm always going to be this person trying to be somewhere where I can't be. I hate the fact that you have to change your own choices and your own life because of disability or mental health or something being a barrier because of society. I've had to give up my life of, like, I got a degree in business, give up that life, and I've decided to go down the life of becoming a writer since like a few months ago. So I've wasted my whole life trying to get into an industry that didn't want me, basically. So I thank you for saying that it's corporate social responsibility. And it's just like this label. Thank you, Gary, for saying that, because seriously, that's the number one thing. The fact that it's pretentious, it's tokenism, and the toxic positivity that you need to create. Like, Maria, tell your story. One company told me, it was an agency who advocates about flexible work. They said, tell your story, but you have to be positive. You can't put and I was like, my life is negative. So I actually emailed back and I said, sorry, I'm not going to tell my story on your platform because I don't believe in what you do. You want me to have like this concept of toxic positivity, and that's not me. You want my real story and the anger that comes with it and the frustration that comes with it and the hope that comes with it, because I've still got hope, then I'll do it. But don't tell me to make it positive. I was so frustrated. So
Maria, thank you. I want to allow space for everybody here, and just a couple of things. One, just to remind you, when you speak to the center rather than having a one-on-one conversation. And I'm really curious to hear from the people who have perhaps more power or influence in organizations. You're hearing a lot of frustration, you're hearing a lot of anger. And Suzie was talking about, how do we design something for inclusion? How do we bridge? How do we bridge between these frustrations and angers and hurt, and the other side of this, which is the people who have the ability and the power to do something about it?
Perhaps I could just put my two pennyworth in. Thank you, Maria and Gary, for your stories. I think what it leaves me feeling is frustration, not just on the behalf of the employee, but also that this is so bad for the organization. So the organizations that Gary and Maria and lots of us aren't working for because of all of those barriers are missing out on all of that talent. And so for me, it's a message to organizations to say, it is counterproductive for you to have staff who feel they can't be themselves, who feel unable to have that psychological safety that Suzie was talking about earlier on. That if I'm having to reinvent myself, which is, what Gary said, I'm not going to be being productive. I'm not going to be being my best self at work because I'm too busy either masking something that I think people will judge me on. So for me, it's about saying to organizations, it is in your interests to make sure that all of your people feel valued and that they belong and that they're included and that they're engaged and that they have a voice and that they are listened to, because that's how you get a productive, innovative workforce that comes up with much more creative ideas, that makes sure that you're not just inclusive internally, but also you're inclusive in the services or products that you're selling, more widely. And actually, influencing organizations to say, this isn't about, let's feel sorry for people who aren't included. This is also about, let's tap into all the talent that's out there without excluding them. And I think if we can put it in those terms, that there is something in it for you too. This isn't about you being charitable. This is about you being ethical. And within that, within those ethics, you will then get better staff, more diverse staff, more productive staff who will open up and challenge and bring new ideas. And, yes, it's good for the individuals because they feel valued and belong, but also it's really good for the organization itself. That's my two pennyworth.
And I agree. And I think it's a big ask for collective vulnerability at that level of the organization. I completely agree with you. And if you're sat around a board table, they'll say, yes, this is competitive advantage. We need this talent. What that requires of them in terms of courageous conversations and taking off their corporate masks, I think is where they struggle. And that's what we need to bridge. I think it's courageous conversations again.
And Suzie, if I can sort of add there, so my role up until recently was sort of very heavily exposed to kind of EC level. And so I was kind of firsthand observing some of the behaviours, and, you know, on the receiving end, indeed, of some of the behaviours. And it was very interesting watching the kind of the disparity between the messaging that was coming out on, for example, you know, our internal intranet, and, you know, you should all be taking care of yourself, and you should be doing this and taking breaks and go for a walk and all this wonderful stuff. And then actually the actual behavior that you then observe as just one example. And I, you know, something that's been playing in my mind since hearing these conversations is, I think, you know, we were doing an okay job at providing a slightly safer space. Sorry, blinded son. A slightly safer space for, I would say, more junior level employees, perhaps. And it was almost expected that one would kind of look out for them and, you know, give them that space. As soon as you hit a certain level within the organization, it really disappears, and that facade, you know, comes on, and there are expectations. And to facilitate or enable that level of vulnerability, I think, is exceptionally hard at those senior levels. And unfortunately, as we all know here, you know, it has to be lead by example. And I don't know how we crack that nut. I don't know how we do it. I think that the systems design piece is key, but it's such an incredibly complex thing, vulnerability. You know, I don't have the answer, but that's you know, that's been my personal experience of it. So you know, what we're talking about here sort of very much resonates in a more practical sense. Very tough.
Like Gary again, I believe it's the person at the top that has to be a true believer. Look at KPMG recently. Bill Michael, chairman, had to resign. We resigned because KPMG, you know, similar to yourself, Kate, we'd have these intranets and emails that talk about helping the community and being helped good and positivity and inclusion, and even coming from Bill Michael. But then behind the scenes in a meeting, he's slamming his staff in that room, saying they're whining and need to think about other people, and it was kind of the opposite, and that he believed that unconscious bias was a load of BS, in his own words. And so it shows that even though this corporate message was sent, he himself didn't believe it, and then it was leaked to the press, and he had to step down because he proved that what the message they were pushing just wasn't what he really believed, unfortunately. So I don't know, I think the person right there, if they haven't got the person right at the top of that pyramid, doesn't believe in it, then you're right, it's never going to change, basically, because it trickles down from the top, doesn't it, basically?
I think...
Yeah, sorry, I was about to bring you in, Romy, and then Rachel as well.
Thanks. But I think, you know, one thing is saying it starts from the top, and definitely courageous leadership is needed, especially, you know, to combine the idea of you see a lot of performance versus, or, you know, sometimes leaders look at these as soft things and box ticking, and it could be greenwashing or whatever kind of washing you want to look at it. But I also think they need some support, and that means training their middle management and training and also the younger employees. You know, I remember when I was on my graduate scheme and in an investment bank, and it starts at that stage where you learn these bad habits and these bad cultures, and you take that with you as you move up the ladder. And if you don't get support at the different stages, and you're not giving managers who are responsible for these younger employees or middle level employees the right skills and the right support and the right freedom to have these vulnerable conversations, it's never ever going to get to the top. And then all you get is a leader saying in his AGM or in his big press announcement that, oh, we need to make this, we need to do this, we're going to do more of that. And it requires them not just to be courageous and say the right things, but put money behind it, put support behind it, and also get and develop these people, because we spend so much time at work. And if we think about most of our life is actually spent in the job, and we need that space and the support to develop as well. So I think that's for me is really crucial, is that seeing that middle management and the younger generations who are coming in, getting the support. So as they move up the ladders, they take good lessons with them And we need to give also, as shareholders, we need to give our leaders more time to make the changes and take some of that pressure off, because these changes will take time and they won't happen overnight.
There's two people with their hands up there. Sorry, Susan. There's two people with their hands up. The dialogue, the thing is with the dialogue that really you need a couple of hours, and we don't have that. So if you can keep your thoughts reasonably tight and concise, we'll be able to hear from as many people as possible. John, you wanted to.
So thanks, Tom. So what has been striking me, I think I was in a group with Gillian, and we were struck by the psychological safety and building that. And I sense this call feels to me like that. As you listen to the call, it feels like a place of safety where we can be honest about stuff. But then, and then in the pre-talk that Gillian and I had, we also had this feeling of, and please forgive the optimism here, just an immense opportunity that we can use the whole diversity through inclusion opportunity as an acceleration moment, really, as a springboard. And what struck us was that a lot of the things that Suzie talked about, the listening and she defined this idea of creating a space where people would say that they don't know, and people would say, "What do you think?" etc. There's an argument. Just a beautiful coaching culture, really. That's nurturing a coaching culture where people are nurtured fundamentally in the ability to listen to each other and to unconditionally love each other. I agreed with Gary when he said that it has to be a leader. But Gary, I think there's something there about the harvest. To see a real harvest, you have to have the top leader buying into it. To actually see the fruit in a company. And there's a simple reason for that, because everybody leaves. All the good people leave if the big boss doesn't accept it. No battery. There we are. I'm back. But the other thing that I agreed with Romy on was that you need to kind of train the younger employees. So there's something about planting the seeds, I think, in the younger people. And then the last, and in fact, in any volunteer in the organisation. As we heard earlier, didn't we? Anybody who's like Maria, anyone who is passionate about it should be allowed to speak into it and to come up with a plan and to put that plan into practice. And then the last thing I would say is there's something about seeding this across the whole population. So one of our crazy ideas at 1010 Academy is to make this stuff available free of charge. In the workplace, but also on housing estates, etc. So there's something about how do we seed or catalyze this accelerative force where people work out how they're going to be in certain situations and how they're going to face each new situation. And we use diversity through inclusion and, as that first opportunity. Because the key thing that Gillian flagged, and she's right, is once you learn how to accelerate through one thing, boy, you can introduce that acceleration to every other area, can't you? So there's something about how do we make that widely available so that we're not creating little fires in little places and we have a few years of good and then a few years of bad, but that actually we create a mighty kind of tsunami of acceleration using this opportunity that we have through that. So those are the kind of things that struck me.
So, Idowu, were you going to say something there?
Rachel, hi.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yes.
But well done. You pronounced it well. It's really interesting hearing all the different views and all the different perspectives, and I think. Certainly the organisation I work for is huge, and actually I would say comparatively is doing pretty well on the face of it from an inclusion and diversity perspective. And the senior leadership are very much behind it from a visual perspective, but I think it's really worth acknowledging that we're dealing with human beings here. And so, you know, when I'm so sorry, I've forgotten the names of the earlier people who spoke, but there was the man who talked about KPMG and the environment there, and then there was a lady who talked about Cass Business School. I'm so sorry, I didn't remember either your names, but you know, both of those people talked about their personal experiences in those organizations and in life as well. And I think the difficulty here is that everyone has an affliction, and I'm putting that in inverted commas. And unless you are, you know, able-bodied, white, middle class, male, straight, whatever perfect looks like, you can look over to other people and think, oh, you know, that person is not having a good time, that experience isn't great. But I'm just not convinced, if I'm really honest, that through conversations, people are genuinely able to, conversations are enough, because I feel like this is how we are, how we are grown from very small. You know, these privileges that we have, maybe our bodies or our minds or whatever, are privileges that come from much earlier. So I think going into businesses and having conversations, it's the best we can do, but I actually think this needs to start much earlier, because there's been lots and lots of studies that show that children from 6 months old start to see from how adults treat them how to react and how to behave to get ahead one way or another. So I'm not convinced that conversations and training is enough. And I don't mean to sound, I'm not meaning to sound negative, but I think, I feel like I've been in enough of these types of conversations to feel that, it's great that people are keen to have these conversations, but ultimately our behaviors and our experiences that we each personally have dictate how we behave. So for example, I am able-bodied, so whilst I can acknowledge that, yes, a person who isn't able-bodied will have challenges, I've never experienced that. So I'm not even 100% sure what I would need to do to make that experience better for someone who wasn't able-bodied. And, for the various different afflictions, again, I'll put it in inverted commas, whether that be race or sexuality or whatever. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to make that point, really.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm ending up facilitating this, which I don't really like doing because that's not the purpose of a dialogue. But Susan, I cut you off a little while ago, so.
Sure. I was going to say, in my previous experience with a large financial organization, I did quite a bit of work with D&I with some of the senior executives. And so while I hear the comment that I've heard a couple of times now, it's up to the person at the top, that's absolutely true. Clearly, KPMG is a perfect example, but it's also the layer below that. And I know someone else previously mentioned middle management. One of the things we were attempting to do, and there's many issues associated with it, but I go back to what Suzie was saying originally about the promotion and talent. We were actively trying to work on managing the talent. So when you were looking at certain senior level managers, not necessarily the guy at the top, but the other people, we were trying to set it up to track how many of them were promoting people who didn't fit that, white male, straight, sort of traditional culture, and sort of tried to get the alternative views coming up through the system. It created massive challenges because it required vulnerability of the people who were willing to say, yes, I'm LGBT, or yes, I carry a disability, or I have a mental health problem. But the idea was, and where we found ourselves stuck, was a lot of these middle managers had embedded in their own mind a view of what leadership meant. And that leadership was who they were and how they looked out. So whether you were a female collaborative leader, or whether you were someone with a disability or a different cultural background, those didn't fit their embed unconscious bias norm of what a leader was. And that to me was where we hit the block. At the end of the day, it was trying to change their attitude. Those who already think that way because they have an experience of a child or a friend or someone else who's expose them to a different view of, they get the fact that this broader view of people is more important, get it. The ones that don't have that experience, they're hard to crack. And the way we were trying to crack them was through measurement and tracking. Because if the guy at the top believed it and you could show him numbers showing, you know, this guy was really building that inclusive group, this other person over here was not, that gave us some data to work with.
And so how far did you actually get? Because you said obviously that you were faced with some challenges, particularly around people actually sort of coming forward and saying, oh yes, I am this or I am that. So did you manage to get a measurement in place in the end, or?
We got some, so we definitely got more with the gender, obviously. We were making reasonably good progress with the sexual orientation because people were becoming more comfortable about declaring themselves that way. Still much more of a struggle with, and some with disability, but much more of a struggle with invisible disability and mental health, because people are very uncomfortable with sharing that, because it's one of those things where there's, I think, to an extent, there is more potential bias around that. And it's one of those things that people still tend to cover. So I wouldn't say we were there, but I think we were starting to make a bit of progress. And my experience, and I hope, you know, this is my positive view, once you get them thinking beyond one sort of group, it sort of helps us to sort of move beyond it. So if gender is the one that becomes easier, then maybe we can move beyond that as well. It's not easy by any means. And it did come with a lot of challenges, but it was certainly challenging for them to ignore it. Let's put it that way. When the numbers were not accurate, they were, you know, we got into all those discussions, but just putting those numbers in front of them made them step back. And I hope over time that will make it kind of a bit more effective. I'm not there anymore, so I don't know if they're still doing it, but.
In terms of tackling the power structures that exist in organisations, I wonder sometimes whether, as people who are involved in the inclusion and diversity topic, we don't help ourselves by continually referring to groups of people rather than to individuals, because no one wants to be seen as representative of a group, I don't think. I certainly don't want to be seen as a part-time working mum. And I don't suppose many white middle-class men want to be seen as representative of that group, with all the negative connotations that brings. So I think part of our problem is the very people who currently hold the power in the power structures that we're trying to break down, they don't feel part of this conversation, I don't think. I don't know if that's something we could maybe think about more.
That's a totally fair point, Anna. That's probably lazy language on my part. But you're absolutely right. There is an element of that where we put people into silos and then it makes it almost worse.
Yeah.
So you're right. We do need to get that intersectionality and broad-based conversation to include everyone. That's a totally fair point.
So I got to go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that also when you think about organizations, you know, the landscape that they're operating in, we're all in this, you know, capitalist system that basically rewards, you know, financial results by quarter, right? So yes, there are some people who really definitely don't give a shit about this at leadership level. There are lots of people who do. I work in a law firm, a big law firm. There are some great leaders at the top who definitely really care. There's a whole challenge within our industry because it's a partnership model. So everybody's kind of off doing their own thing. So that's difficult to kind of have a sort of one approach. And you know what am I going to spend more time on if I'm, you know, a leader of a practice group in my firm? You know, I've got massive pressure to deliver financial results at the end of this quarter, at the end of this year. So am I going to spend my time doing billable work, or am I going to spend my time seeing who I could mentor in my practice group who needs a leg up? So I think that external environment is, you know, a big challenge. But I also think when you're in this kind of environment, you know, the capitalist world is a competitive world, right? So law firms are massively competitive with one another. So if you can change one thing within your firm, or you sign on to something, or you commit to some kind of tracking, metrics, whatever, what you find in our industry is that everybody wants to be part of it. You know, nobody wants to miss out, and nobody wants to not be seen to be doing that, because it's a way that we differentiate ourselves outside of legal services delivery. If I'm a company, who cares who gives me my advice, my legal advice. You know, I can put pressure on the law firms that I might give work to by saying, yes, you do great work, you do great billable work, but what about your D&I stuff? And we get lots of pressure from our clients, and I think they drive a lot of that. So I think there's something about, yeah, that wider context and how you use that. I don't want to say against, you know, your organization internally, but, you know, you can say, well, look, XYZ firms are doing this, you know, this is the direction of travel. What do we say about this? What do we care about this? You know, what are we going to do now to invest so that we're not left behind in 2-3 years' time and we've got nothing to say on this topic?
One thing that has struck me as I've been listening in this afternoon is, and it's a new thing for me, something I didn't realize, was that before we can accelerate in this area, there's quite a bit of healing that needs to be done. And what's striking me is that the people who want to accelerate it are often the people who also have who also want to heal, just put it like that. So they've suffered that at the hand maybe of stuff. And I was with Talia then when she was talking about, you know, how do we, well, the thing that struck me as Talia was speaking was this thing about how do we get what we're trying to achieve here to be a profit center for businesses, not a cost center. Because a great way of getting the visibility of the top people in an organization and getting them to kind of press the button to allow us to harvest the great progress we might make is when they realize that actually it's in their interest from a profitability point of view, and suddenly it starts going downhill down the other side and it gathers momentum when it's been such a chug to get it up the hill to the point that we're trying to get it. So what struck me in that is that I guess it's a little bit like that old analogy of you're changing the engine as you're flying along. You know, it'd be nice to be able to land and change the engine, but no, we've got to change the engine as we're flying along from the point of view of it's us who are hurting about it, who need to do the high jump, and yet it's us who've kind of pulled a ligament or such, pulled a muscle, and we need to heal, but we need to do the jumping at the same time. So I'm intrigued by that, and I'm also intrigued by, and again, forgive me for being super optimistic always, but I think this is an opportunity for the tail to wag the dog a little bit. You know, this is one of the areas, isn't it, in which a business should be accelerating. It's just one of probably 10, 15 different areas they should be accelerating. Climate is an obvious one. I don't know, profitability might be one, efficiency might be another. This is just one of the areas that a business is ought to be trying to accelerate in. Yet wouldn't it be a great one for us to kind of wag the tail of, for us to wag the dog, so to speak, on this one, and then allow them, by doing so, and go to them and say, look, we're going to empower you to then accelerate all these other areas, but we're going to do it from this basis, and we're going to heal. We're going to be healed the organization is going to be healed as we do so. And if nothing else, we would then become a business where good, and I use that word, you know, kind of reservedly, but good people would join our business and do a great job, and they would be brilliant at their work. And that's often the key thing here. We are parts of a body, different parts of a body, but we're just called to be brilliant at the thing we do, aren't we? We don't need to be what other people do in the business. We need to do what we do. So that struck me, the whole thing about healing and accelerating.
Thank you, John. That's I love the optimism that you're throwing into the center there. We're just about to finish. So Suzie, I wonder whether you'd like to say any final words.
I've got so much to say, but I think I love the optimism. I do think it's an opportunity. I really like the idea of acceleration, but it's not about accelerating what exists today. And I think we've had a lot of discussions around quotas and systemic bias in the system. I think it is about going back to the drawing board and being bold enough and courageous enough to have that conversation of, yes, we need to measure. What are we measuring? And why? And what does inclusion look like? Yes, it needs to come from the top, but I'm also a great believer in grassroots momentum. I think we're getting it from generations, but we're also getting it from people, particularly after COVID, who've had the time to think about what really motivates them and what their purpose is. And they're going to come back into the organization with different expectations and a different voice. So I think, and to take Rachel's point around divergent thinking and, you know, conversations are not enough, which I wholly agree with, but I think we need to change the conversation figuratively and create a space where we can actually act as well as talk about it. So yeah, I think that they're my last thoughts.
Thanks, Suzie. When we have more space, we normally invite everybody just to check out, to just say a couple of words about how they're feeling and what they're taking away. We're very limited for time, but the floor is open, not for a long comment, but just how you're feeling as we leave.
I'll start. I just feel honoured to have been allowed to listen, really, and learn today. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just thank you for another great meeting. Really enjoyed it.
Really useful dialogue, so lots to think about.
This was my first session. Sorry, this was my first session, so it's really good to meet everybody and hear from some, you know, what feels like experts in the field. So I've learned a lot. So thank you.
You bet. I think I heard diverse perspectives, and it's good to hear what everyone's thinking and how they're applying D&I in their own workplace, and it's good stuff. I'm happy to be on this meeting.
I want to thank everybody for opening up some new tangents that I may not have seen before, or helping to clarify things that maybe I kind of glossed over in some ways. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks for having us today. Really appreciate that.
Thanks to Suzie for a great talk there, and I feel energized.
Yeah, thank you to Suzie. It's definitely helped me look at diversity and inclusion from a different perspective, more empathetic one than I may have not looked at it before. So thank you very much.
Okay, so we've come to the end. I'd just like to acknowledge Gillian. Without you and your amazing networking, Suzie wouldn't have been here. So thank you for that. And thank you to Suzie for your passion and your words of wisdom. Our next session is in a month's time, the third Thursday, which, if I remember correctly, is the 18th of March. And it's looking at LGBTQ+ with a particular lens on optimizing organizations to be inclusive. So do come back, see us again. And right now, thank you to all. Go well, go safely. Thank you.